Chapter 7. The Coalition. When Lawler reached Willett's one street, he saw a buckboard drawn by two gray horses. The vehicle was headed west, away from him, and the horses were walking. The distance between himself and the buckboard was not great, and he saw that it was occupied by two women, one of them the woman whom he had met at the foot of the stairs leading to Warden's office. The other was elderly and was looking straight ahead, but the young woman's head was turned toward Lawler at the instant Lawler caught sight of the buckboard. It seemed to him that the young woman must have been watching him before he became aware of the buckboard, for there was a smile on her face as she looked at him, and when she seemed sure that he was looking, she gaily waved a white handkerchief. Lawler did not answer the signal. He looked around, thinking that perhaps the woman might have waved the handkerchief at some friend she had just left, and when he turned she had her back to him. Lawler was conscious of a pulse of amusement over the woman's action, though he experienced no fatuous thrill. The woman was frivolous, and had made no appeal to his imagination. Besides, Lawler was in no mood for frivolous thought. He was having his first experience with the invisible and subtle power that ruled the commerce of the nation, and his thoughts were serious, almost vicious. Somewhere, a mighty hand had halted activity in the Wolf River section. A power, stealthy, sinister, had interfered with the business in which he was vitally interested, interrupting it, disturbing it. Lawler had kept himself well informed. In the big library at the Circle, were various volumes relating to economics that had been well thumbed by him. He had been privately educated by his mother, and among the books that lined the shelves of the library were the philosophers, ancient and modern, the masters of art, science, and letters, and a miscellany of authorities on kindred subjects. When his father had insisted that he be educated, he had studied the political history of his state. He had kept a serious eye upon the activities of all the politicians of note. He had kept his mind open and free from party prejudice. He knew that the present governor of the state was incapable or swayed by invisible and malign influences. He was aware that the state railroad commissioner lacked aggressiveness, or that he had been directed to keep in the background. And he was also aware that for a year or more the people of the state had regretted electing the present governor, the dissatisfaction manifesting itself in various ways, though chiefly in the tone of the editorials published by the newspapers in the towns. As the average newspaper editor endeavors to anticipate public opinion, he invariably keeps himself well informed concerning the activities of an office holder, that he may be prepared to campaign against him at the instant he detects dissatisfaction among his subscribers. And the present governor was being scathingly arraigned by the newspapers of the state, while he sat in smug complacence in his office at the Capitol. He had made no effort to correct some of the evils of government about which he had raged just before the election. Lawler smiled with grim amusement as he walked toward the Willett's Hotel, where he meant to stay overnight, for he was convinced that the car shortage could not exist if the state officials, especially the railroad commissioner, would exert authority to end it. It seemed to Lawler that there must exist a secret understanding between the railroad commissioner and the invisible power represented by Gary Warden, and he wondered at the temerity of the governor, the sheer, brazen disregard for the public welfare that permitted him to become leagued with the invisible power in an effort to rob the cattle owners of the state. He must certainly know that he had been elected by the cattle owners, that their votes and the votes of their employees had made it possible for him to gain the office he had sought. But perhaps, and Lawler's lips curved with bitterness, the governor wanted only one term, for 2 years of complete and absolute control of the cattle industry of the state would make him wealthy enough to hold public opinion in contempt. From a window of his office, Gary Warden had watched Lawler go into the station building, and from the same window Warden saw Lawler emerge. He watched Lawler, noting the gravity of his face, exulting, smiling mockingly. Warden also noted the little drama of the fluttering handkerchief, and the smile went out in a black. Jealous rage seized him. However, Gary Warden and Jay Simmons were not the only persons in town who watched Lawler. When he had entered town, the school children who had preceded him had watched him from in front of the Wolf, and half a dozen lean-faced, rugged, and prosperous-looking men had watched him from the lounging room of the Willits Hotel. The men in the lounging room were watching Lawler now as he walked toward the building, for they seemed to divine that he would enter. When Lawler stepped over the threshold, his lips were set in stern, serious lines, and his brows were drawn together in a frown, for his thoughts were dwelling upon the sinister power that threatened to create confusion in the section. He did not see the men in the lounging room until he had taken several steps toward the desk, and then he glanced carelessly toward them. Instantly, his eyes glowed with recognition. He walked toward them. "Howdy," Lawler greeted one, extending a hand, and "howdy" was the word that passed the lips of the others as Lawler shook hands with them. He called them all by name, but it was to the first man that he spoke after the amenities had been concluded. "I heard you were in town, Caldwell," he said. Caldwell, a big man with a black beard, probing, intelligent eyes, and an aggressive chin, grinned grimly. "Gary Warden tell you?" he asked. "No, Warden didn't mention you." "Then it was Jay Simmons. You ain't been anywhere else. How do you know?" Caldwell exchanged glances with his companions. "I reckon we've been watching you, Lawler. We seen you ride into town on Red King, and we seen you go over to the station from Warden's office." "Watching me?" queried Lawler. "What for?" "I reckon we wanted to see how you took it." "Took what?" "What Warden and Simmons had to say to you. We got ours. Me yesterday, Barthman and Littlefield this morning, and Court, Sigmund, and Lester the day before yesterday. I reckon the whole section will get it before long. Looks like they're trying to squeeze us. How many steers did you sell to Warden at 25? Lawler grinned. "And Simmons," said Caldwell gleefully. "No cars. Seems Simmons ain't McKin, no exceptions. We've all heard the same story. We knowed you'd be in, and we sort of waited around wonderin' what you'd do about it. We didn't bring no cattle over, for we hadn't made no arrangement with Jim Leffingwell, like you done, and we didn't want to stampede Warden." Lawler told them what had occurred in his interview with Warden. "I reckon Warden's the liar, all right," declared Caldwell. Jim Leffingwell's word was the only contract anyone ever needed with him. He looked keenly at Lawler. "What you aimin' to do?" he questioned. "I've been thinking it over," said Lawler. "You ain't figurin' to lay down to the cusses." Caldwell's voice was low and cold. Lawler looked straight at him, smiling. Caldwell laughed, and the others grinned. "Lawler, we knowed you wouldn't," declared Caldwell. "But a man's got a right to ask, right here and now something has got to be done. Looks to me as if we've got to play this game to a showdown, and we might as well start right now. There ain't none of us men going to let Gary Warden and the railroad company run our business. But there is a few owners around here that ain't got no stomach for a fight, and they'd sell to Warden for $10 rather than have any trouble. Them's the guys we've got to talk mighty plain to, for if they go to sellin' for what they can get, they'll make it all fired uncomfortable for us. This is a free country, Caldwell. So far as I'm concerned, every man runs his own ranch and sells for what he thinks is a fair price. If we go to interfering with them, we'd be as bad as Warden and the railroad company." "Lawler, you're right," agreed Caldwell, after reflecting a moment. "I didn't realize that. At first, a man don't think when he is mad clear through, but it is mighty plain. We've got to stand on our own feet if we stand at all." Barthman, a tall, lean-faced man, cleared his throat. "Lawler, you're the man to handle this thing. You've got the most money, the most brains, and you're known all over the state, on account of them slick Herefords you've been raisin', and on account of headin' the delegation to the state convention last fall from this county. You can talk, for you mighty near stampeded that convention last fall. If you'd said the word, you'd have been governor today instead of that dumb coyote which is holding down the office now. You've got the reputation and the backbone, and they've got to listen to you. I've heard that cattle owners all over the state are gettin' the same deal." Barthman's eyes gleamed with passion. "I propose that you be elected chairman of this miteen, and that you be instructed to hop on the mornin' train and go to the railroad commissioner at the Capitol, and tell him that if he don't give orders to bust up this thievin' combination, the cattle owners of this county We'll come down there and yank off his hide. Chapter 8. A Woman's Mercy. Gary Warden did not stand at the office window many minutes after he saw Lawler on the street. He drew on his coat, took his hat from a hook on the wall, and descended the stairs. At the street door, he glanced swiftly around, saw Red King standing at the hitching rail in front of the building, and several other horses farther up the street. There were several men on the sidewalks, but he did not see Lawler. Grinning crookedly, Warden crossed the street and made his way to the station building, where a few minutes later he was talking with Simmons. Simmons was visibly excited. There was curiosity in Warden's gaze. "He is wise," said Simmons. He was still wiping perspiration from his forehead, and he mechanically repeated to Warden the words he had uttered to himself immediately after Lawler left his office. "I'm glad it is over. I've been dreading it. He is the only one in the whole bunch that I was afraid of. There'll be hell to pay in this section now. Pure, unadulterated hell, and no mistake." And then he added something that had occurred to him afterward. "If the big guys back of this thing knowed Kane Lawler as well as I know him, they'd have thought a heap before they started this thing." "Bah," sneered Warden. "You're raving. We know what we are doing. You do as you're told, that is all. And keep your mouth shut. Just keep on telling them there are no cars. That is the truth, isn't it?" He grinned gleefully at Simmons. "So he is wise, eh?" he added. "Well, I'm damned glad of it. The sagebrush rummy will make him hump before we get through with him." Hatred of Lawler had seized Warden, a passion that ran through his veins with the virulence of a strong poison. It had been the incident of the fluttering handkerchief that had aroused him. Until then he had merely disliked Lawler, aware of the latent strength of him, his rugged manliness, and his quiet confidence. All those evidences of character had irritated him, for they had brought an inevitable contrast between himself and the man, and he knew he lacked those things which would have made him Lawler's equal. He felt inferior, and the malevolence that accompanied the conviction was reflected in his face as he faced Simmons. "No cars now. Damn them. Not a single car, understand, Simmons. No cars. You can't get them. No matter what happens, you can't get cars. For anybody." He left Simmons and descended to the street. As he passed the front of the Willits Hotel, he saw Lawler and his friends inside, but Lawler had his back turned, and the others were interestedly watching him, gesturing and talking. Warden entered the front door of the Wolf. He stopped at the bar for a drink, and the barkeeper told him, in reply to his question, that Singleton was in a rear room. Singleton was alone. He was sitting in a chair at a table with a glass in front of him, and he was staring abstractedly at the floor when Warden entered. Closing the door behind him, Warden drew a chair up to the table and dropped into it, and then for the first time he looked closely at Singleton's face and saw the gash on his left cheek. The wound had been treated, but beneath the cloth at one end Warden could see the open flesh. "What in blazes has happened to you?" inquired Warden. "Lawler," growled Singleton. "He walloped my kid down at the schoolhouse, and when I went down there to take the kid's part, he walloped me too." He grinned lugubriously. "I didn't know the cuss could hit so hard," he muttered. "Warden, he salivated me. Hit me so derned hard, I thought the roof had dropped on me." Warden stiffened, then leaned forward, his lips loose, his eyes malignant. "What do you carry those 2 guns for?" "Singleton, I thought you knew how to use them. Men have told me you know." "Bah," exclaimed Singleton. His gaze met Warden's, his eyes gleaming with resentment. "What do you know about Kane Lawler?" "I hate him, Singleton." "Well, I reckon you ain't the only one. I ain't exactly in love with the cuss myself. I was thinking of my guns when I was with him in the schoolhouse, but somehow I didn't feel like tacking a chance on slinging 'em. I ain't trying to explain nothin'. I just couldn't make my hands go for 'em, that is all. Hell, I reckon the man who can draw a gun on Kane Lawler when he is looking at him ain't been born yet. But I'm gettin' square with him for wallopin' me. I'm lettin' you know that, right enough. You'll have your chance, Singleton. Lawler will have to trail his cattle, as far as Red Rock anyway. Singleton's eyes glowed with venomous satisfaction. He grinned evilly at Warden. So he wouldn't do business with you, eh? I knowed it, and I've been gettin' ready. Ha, ha. He'll wish he had. Blondie Antrim rode in as far as Kinney's Caon last night. I met him and had a long talk with him. He is keen for it. Says he admires any guy which can plan a thing that big. Grinned like a hyena when I told him the big guy's back of it. Wouldn't let any law interfere. He has got 70 men, he says, daredevil gun fighters from down south apiece, which will do anything he tells them and howl for more. Warden moistened his lips as he grinned his satisfaction. There is only one trail, Singleton. You are sure of that? One trail, the Tom Long Trail. The devil himself couldn't find another through that country. Warden leaned back in his chair, laughing lowly. Into his manner as he sat there came a confidence that had not been there before, bold, arrogant. His laugh had a sinister quality in it. In his eyes was the light of greed, and as he watched Singleton, something else came into his eyes, something abysmal, causing them to narrow and glow with a bestial light. Singleton, he said, his voice thick and throaty, when I stepped into Jim Leffingwell's boots, the County Board of Education appointed me to succeed Leffingwell as school commissioner for Willits. It strikes me that something ought to be done about the teacher punishing your boy. I think I had better have a talk with her. Shucks, growled Singleton. I reckon the kid deserved what he got. He was trying to wallop her when Lawler come in. I ain't admirin' Ruth Hamlin none, but I reckon she wasn't to blame for that. If you was figurin' to see Lawler now, why that would be more to the point. He grinned crookedly at Warden, slight mockery in his gaze. Warden scowled. That is your job, Singleton. If he tries to wallop me as he walloped you, I'll have something to say to him. It is safer to telegraph to the cuss, grinned Singleton sourly. Warden apparently did not hear Singleton's last words, for he was gazing meditatively past him. He took leave of Singleton and walked to the front of the saloon, where he stood for many minutes leaning on the bar, thoughtfully looking out into the street. The shadows of the buildings across the street from him had grown long, and the light from the sun was mellowing when Warden walked to the front door and stood for an instant on the threshold. Down the street in front of his office stood Red King. Other horses were hitched here and there, but there was no human being in sight. The quiet peace of the waning afternoon had settled over town. It was the period when human activity slackens. Warden stepped down upon the sidewalk. There was a furtive gleam in his eyes. His face was flushed. He was in the grip of a passion that thoughts of Ruth Hamlin had brought to him. He had seen the girl a number of times. He had talked with her twice. Each time when he had talked with her, he had felt the heat of a great desire seize him, and during his talk with Singleton, he had yielded to the impulse that was now driving him. Just why the impulse had come to him at that instant he could not have told. He knew Cain Lawler's name had been mentioned in connection with the girls, and it might have been that his hatred of Lawler and the sudden jealousy that had developed in him over the incident of the fluttering handkerchief had gripped him. But he was aware that just at this time he was risking much, risking his life and jeopardizing the business venture in which he was engaged. Yet the impulse which was driving him had made him reckless. It had dulled his sense of responsibility, had swept away all considerations of caution. When he saw there was no one on the street, he walked eastward to the livery stable, where he kept his horse, saddled and bridled it, mounted and rode away. His ranch, the Two Diamond, was 15 miles southwestward. Warden rode directly east, bearing a little south after he had traveled some distance from town, striking a narrow trail that wound a sinuous course over the plains. The passion that had seized Warden still held him. He told himself that he really intended merely to call upon Ruth professionally in his role of school commissioner. He assured himself that she must be made to understand that the forcible disciplining of her pupils would not be tolerated. Yet as he rode, he kept glancing backward apprehensively, though he knew that if he made his visit merely official, he need have nothing to fear from anyone. Twice, as Warden rode, he halted his horse and debated the wisdom of returning, and twice he rode on again, telling himself he had a right to visit the girl, and that he meant no harm. At most, he desired merely to see the girl again, to experience the thrills that he had felt upon the other occasions he had talked with her. And when at dusk he came in sight of the Hamlin cabin, he felt that he had really come on an official visit. He saw Ruth's pony saddled and bridled, standing at a corner of the corral where she had left him when she had returned from the schoolhouse some hours before. She had found the house unoccupied when she arrived. There was evidence that her father had left shortly after breakfast, for the dishes were unwashed and the floor unswept, two duties that he always had performed, knowing that in the morning she had a 10-mile ride before her. Table and floor had been attended to by the girl, but she had done little else. For hours she had sat in a chair near the front door, thinking of what had happened in the schoolhouse, of what she had heard, the evidence that Kane Lawler knew what her father had been doing, and that he was trying to protect her. She believed it was the latter knowledge that made her feel so small, so insignificant, so utterly miserable. For while she was convinced that he would think no less of her, no matter what her father had done, the fact that Lawler was trying to keep the knowledge of her father's guilt from her told her that he appreciated the keen disgrace that threatened her. When Warden dismounted near the cabin door, she thought it was her father returning, and she got up and went to the stove, where she stood, lifting the iron lids, preparatory to starting a fire. She felt that she could not look at her father after what had happened, and so she laid some wood in the stove, deliberately keeping her back to the door, trying to think of something to say to her father. For she had determined to tell him about the incident of the morning. She was forced to go to a shelf for matches, however, and when she turned, her eyes flashing with accusation, she saw Warden standing in the open doorway, watching her. She stood very still and spoke no word. When Warden noted the swift change of expression that came over her face, the astonishment that instantly dominated all else, he grinned smoothly. "Surprised to see me, Miss Hamlin? You shouldn't be, after what happened at the schoolhouse today. I have called to have a talk with you about it." The girl's quick smile was cold and indifferent. What happened to her now was of little importance. She supposed Warden had come to tell her she had been discharged, but that made little difference to her. She felt that she had done right in attempting to chastise Jimmy Singleton, and she would do it again under the same circumstances. "Is it necessary to talk?" she questioned coldly. "I am not sorry for what I did. I suppose you have come to notify me of my dismissal." "On the contrary, I have come to assure you that you did what was right, exactly what I would have done," smiled Warden. "The only criticism I have is that you should not have dismissed school. You should have stayed right there and had it out." Warden stepped inside and walked close to Ruth. "I want to shake hands with you, Miss Hamlin. You have the necessary spirit." Some color surged into Ruth's face. She realized now that she did not want to lose the position, that it meant much to her. It meant at least her independence from her father, that she could support herself without depending upon the money he gained from his guilty practices. It meant, too, that the additional disgrace of being summarily dismissed would not descend upon her. Impulsively, she took Warden's hand. She looked inquiringly at him, though, when he gripped it tightly, and the color that had come into her face fled, leaving it pale when Warden continued to hold the hand, gripping it so hard that she could not withdraw it. She looked intently at him over the few feet of space that was between them, noting the queer light in his eyes, a glow of passion, watching the crimson tide that rose above his collar, staining his face darkly. For the driving desire that had seized Warden had conquered him. Physical contact with the girl had brought his passions to life again. They had overwhelmed him, had sent his grain skittering back into those dead and gone periods when man's desires surmounted laws. Warden no longer considered the risks whose ghosts had haunted him on his ride to the Hamlin cabin. His fears had been swallowed by the oblivion of mental irresponsibility. He had only the vivid knowledge that he was alone in the cabin with the girl. But there are people in Willits who are determined that you shall go, he said. I can keep you on the job in spite of them, my dear, and I'll do it. But there are certain conditions, certain... She struck him then, bringing her free hand around with a wide, full sweep. The open hand landed on the side of his face with a smack that resounded through the cabin, staggering him, causing him to release the other hand. A great red welt appeared on his cheek where the hand had struck, and he felt of his cheek with his fingers, amazed, incredulous. For an instant only, however, he stood, trying to wipe the sting of the blow away. Then he laughed throatily and started after her, she having retreated behind the table where she stood, watching him, her eyes wide, her face dead white. Warden, leaning far over the table, saw her eyes close as she stood there, saw her fingers grip the edge of the table, noted that her chin had dropped and that she seemed to be on the point of fainting. Warden's back was toward the front door. He had to slip sideways to get around the table, and as he did so, his profile was brought toward the door. He saw a shadow at his feet, a shadow cast by the last effulgent glow of the setting sun, a shadow made by a man standing in the doorway. Warden halted and held hard to the table edge. Reason, cold, remorseless reason, surged back into his brain, accompanied by a paralyzing fear. Some prescience told him that the man in the doorway was Cain Lawler, and though he was convinced of it, he was a long time lifting his head and in turning it the merest trifle toward the door. And when he saw that the dread apparition was indeed Lawler, and that Lawler's heavy pistol was extending from his side, the hand and arm behind it rigid, he stiffened, flung himself around, and faced Lawler, his mouth open, his eyes bulging with the terrible dread of death and the awful certainty that death was imminent. For an instant there was a silence, breathless, strained, pregnant with the promise of tragedy. Then the silence was rent by Lawler's voice, dry, light, and vibrant. Warden, if you move a quarter of an inch, I'll blow you to hell. Lawlers walked slowly to Ruth, took her by the shoulders and steadied her. It's Lawler, Ruth, he said reassuringly. I want you to tell me what's wrong here. He shook her gently, and she opened her eyes and looked at him dazedly. Then, as she seemed to recognize him, to become convinced that it was really Lawler whom she had seen in the doorway, she smiled and rested her head on his shoulder, her hands patting his arms and his back as though to convince herself beyond doubt. For an instant she stood there, holding tightly to him, and then she released herself, stepping back with flushed cheeks and shamed eyes. Cain, I am so glad you came, she said. Why, Cain, that man. She shuddered and covered her face with her hands. I reckon that's all, said Lawler. There was a cold, bitter grin on his lips as he stepped around the table and stood in front of Warden. Warden, I'm going back to town with you. We're going right now. Go out and get on your horse. Lawler's voice, the cold flame in his eyes, and his icy deliberation told Ruth of a thing that plainly Warden had already seen, that though both men would begin the ride to town, only Lawler would reach there. Ruth watched, fascinated, her senses dulled by what she saw in Lawler's manner and in the ghastly white of Warden's face. Warden understood, he understood, and his breath was labored, his flesh palsied, and still he was going to obey. For Ruth saw him move, saw him sway toward the door, saw Lawler watching him as though he was fighting to hold his passions in check, fighting back a lust to kill the man where he stood. Warden had reached the door. He was crossing the threshold, his head bowed, his shoulders sagging, his legs bending at the knees when Ruth moved. She ran around the table and got between Lawler and Warden, stretching her arms in the open doorway, barring Lawler's way. Her eyes were wild with terror. "Don't, Kane," she begged. "Don't do that. Oh, I know what you mean to do. Please, Kane, let him go. Alone. He didn't do what?" She paused, shuddering. Lawler's eyes softened as he looked at her. He smiled faintly, and she knew she had won. She did not resist when he drew her gently away from the door. Standing just inside, she saw him go out to where Warden stood, pale and shaking, looking at both of them. Then she heard Lawler's voice as he spoke to Warden. "Warden, I'm letting you off. Miss Ruth is going to teach school where she's been teaching it. The schoolhouse is your deadline, the same as this cabin. Whenever you step into one or the other, your friends are going to mourn for you. Get going." It was a long time before Lawler moved, and when he did re-enter the cabin, Ruth was nowhere to be seen. Lawler paused near the center of the big room and gazed about him. The door leading to one of the rooms that ran from the big room was open. The other was closed. He walked to the closed door and stood before it, his lips set in grim lines, his eyes somber. "Ruth," he called lowly. There was no answer, and again he called. This time, a smothered voice reached him, quavering, tearful. "Please go away, Kane. I don't want to see you. I'm so upset. I reckon I'll go, Ruth." But still he lingered, watching the door, now smiling faintly, understandingly. Beyond the door were the sounds of sobbing. Lawler folded his arms over his chest, and with the fingers of one hand caressing his chin, watched the door. "Ruth," he said finally, "where is your father?" I don't know, and I don't care." Lawler started, and his eyes narrowed with suspicion as he looked at the door. It seemed that he was trying to peer through it. "Ruth," he said slowly, "I saw you looking into the schoolhouse through the broken window after I hit Singleton the second time, and while I was talking to him. What did you hear?" "Everything, Kane. Everything." The sobs were furious now. Lawler frowned through a silence during which his eyes glowed savagely. Then, after a while, he spoke again. "I've known it for a long time, Ruth." "Oh," she sobbed. "It was Singleton's fault. He won't do it anymore." There was no answer. A brooding silence came from beyond the door. Then Lawler said gently, "Ruth, I'm asking you again. Will you marry me?" "I'll never marry you. Now, Kane. Never, never, never." The sobs had ceased now, but the voice was choked with emotion. "All right, Ruth," said Lawler. "I'll ask you again. Sometime. And the next time, you won't refuse." He crossed the floor and stepped outside. Leaping into the saddle, he sent Red King thundering away from the cabin into the dusk that swathed the southern distance. A yellow moon was rising above the peaks of the hills at the far edge of the Wolf River Valley when Lawler dismounted from Red King and strode to the big Circle L bunkhouse. Inside, a kerosene lamp burned on a table around which were several men. The men looked up in astonishment as Lawler entered, then got to their feet, looking at Lawler wonderingly, for on his face was an expression that none of them ever had seen there before. "Have any of you seen Joe Hamlin?" said Lawler. A yellow-haired giant among them grinned widely and pointed eloquently toward a bunk where a man's body, swathed in blankets, could be seen. "That's him," said the yellow-haired giant. "He hit here this morning, saying you'd hired him, and that he was standing straight up on his legs like a man hereafter. We took him on under them conditions." Lawler strode to the bunk. He deliberately unrolled the blankets, seized Hamlin by the middle, and lifted him, setting him down on the floor ungently. By the time Lawler released him, Hamlin had his eyes open, and he blinked in bewilderment at the faces of the men, opening his mouth with a snap when he saw Lawler. "Lawler, what in blazes is the matter? I ain't done nothing." "You're going to do something," declared Lawler. He waited until Hamlin dressed. Then he led him outside. At an end of the corral fence where no one could hear, Lawler talked long and earnestly to Hamlin, and when Hamlin left, riding a Circle L horse, he was grinning. "It's a straight trail, Hamlin," said Lawler gravely as Hamlin rode away. "A straight trail, and not a word to Ruth." "Straight it is, Lawler," answered Hamlin. "I'm testifying to that